on the edge of Lake Superior, where the water stretches endlessly into gray silence, there stands a mansion that looks as though it has been paused in time. Its stone walls rise calmly above the shoreline, its windows perfectly aligned, its gardens meticulously preserved. To visitors, Glensheen Mansion appears serene, dignified, almost comforting, a masterpiece of early 20th century American wealth. But this calm is deceptive. Because beneath the symmetry, beneath the craftsmanship and polish, Glensheen carries a story that refuses to rest. A story where power did not protect, wealth did not save, and blood was spilled in a house designed to be untouchable. Glensheen was never meant to be quiet. When it was completed in 1908, it stood as a declaration of dominance, announcing that its owner had conquered industry, land, and status itself. The mansion was not simply built to house a family. It was built to project control. Every corridor, every lock, every hidden passage reflected an obsession with order and permanence. Glensheen was engineered to outlast generations, to remain unchallenged by time, fortune, or outsiders. And for decades, it seemed to succeed. From the outside, Glensheen embodied everything Americans admired about old money: restraint, discretion, and stability. Unlike the loud excess of East Coast dynasties, this was Midwestern aristocracy, quiet, deliberate, and self-contained. The mansion overlooked the lake like a watchful guardian, removed from the chaos of the modern world. Inside its walls, the Congdon family lived according to rules shaped by hierarchy and distance. Insulated from ordinary life by staff, schedules, and silence, but houses, like families, absorb what happens inside them. Over time, Glensheen became less a sanctuary and more a sealed environment. Relationships hardened. Trust narrowed. Power concentrated. The very features meant to ensure privacy and security slowly turned inward, amplifying isolation rather than preventing danger. What had once been a symbol of control began to feel like a closed system with no release date in June of 1977. That system failed catastrophically. Violence entered Glensheen, not from the outside but from within. The shock was immediate and national. Newspapers across America carried the same question. How could something so brutal occur in a place designed to represent order and refinement? The answer was not simple, and it was not comforting, because the tragedy of Glensheen is not just a crime story. It is a story about legacy, about what happens when wealth becomes inheritance instead of ambition, when protection turns into isolation, and when power creates dependence rather than security. The murders did not destroy the mansion, but they permanently altered its meaning. Glensheen could no longer be seen only as an architectural triumph. It became a symbol of something darker, the moment when old money's illusion of control finally cracked. Today, visitors walk its halls in hushed voices, drawn by beauty and haunted by what they know happened there. The rooms are immaculate. The furniture remains perfectly arranged. Nothing appears disturbed. And yet, Glensheen feels heavy, as though it remembers everything. This is not just the story of a mansion or even a murder. It is the story of how absolute wealth can conceal fractures until they break, and how the most carefully constructed worlds can collapse without warning. Long before Glensheen rose above the rocky shoreline of Lake Superior, the forces that would make it possible were already reshaping America. In the late 19th century, the nation was accelerating toward industrial dominance, and the Midwest, once dismissed as peripheral, had become a center of extraction, transportation, and legal power. At the heart of this transformation stood Chester Adgate Congdon, a man whose fortune was not inherited but engineered through strategy, timing, and ruthless precision. To understand Glensheen, one must first understand Congdon, not as a homeowner, but as a builder of systems. Chester Congdon was born in 1853. At a moment when the American frontier was still open and the rules of wealth had not yet hardened. He did not rise through manufacturing or mining in the traditional sense. Instead, he mastered the machinery that allowed those industries to function: law, contracts, land rights, and corporate structure. Congdon became one of the most powerful legal architects of the iron ore industry, a sector that would soon feed America's railroads, factories, and cities. He did not swing a pickaxe. He controlled who was allowed to dot. At the center of his rise was the Mesaba Iron Range in northern Minnesota, one of the richest iron ore deposits ever discovered. As mining companies rushed to exploit it, chaos followed, conflicting land claims, unclear ownership, and legal ambiguity. Congdon thrived in this uncertainty. Representing industrial giants like U.S. Steel, he secured mineral rights, negotiated leases, and ensured that profits flowed upward, not outward. His work did not produce headlines, but it produced leverage. And leverage, in the industrial age, was power. By the early 20th century, Congdon had positioned himself at the intersection of law, industry, and transportation. He invested in railroads that moved ore from mine to port. He structured corporations that controlled extraction and distribution. His influence extended far beyond Minnesota, touching national markets and global trade. While other industrialists sought visibility, Congdon preferred insulation. His wealth was immense, but his presence was discreet. This discretion would become a defining trait of both the man and the mansion he would eventually build. With fortune secured, Congdon turned his attention to permanence. Wealth in the industrial age was volatile, subject to market crashes and political reform. But land, particularly land chosen carefully, offered stability. On the shores of Lake Superior, Congdon found the ideal location to anchor his legacy. Duluth was booming, fueled by iron ore and shipping. The lake itself served as a gateway to the world. Building there was not a retreat. It was a strategic statement. When Congdon commissioned Glensheen, he was not attempting to rival the ostentatious palaces of the East Coast. He was creating something more controlled. The mansion would be large but not flamboyant, elegant but not excessive. Every choice reflected calculated restraint. This was a house built by a man who understood systems and boundaries, not spectacle. Its purpose was to endure, not impress. Congdon's personal life reinforced this ethos. He married Clara Bannister, and together they raised children within a framework of discipline and hierarchy. Emotional distance was normalized. Privacy was paramount. Servants maintained order, schedules dictated interaction, and authority was rarely questioned. Glensheen was not a warm home. It was an organized environment. The mansion mirrored the worldview of its creator: structured, contained, and resistant to disruption. Yet this very structure introduced fragility. Congdon's system worked as long as he was present to manage it. He understood every contract, every boundary, every unspoken rule. But systems built around a single mind struggled to survive succession. As Congdon aged, control began to diffuse. Wealth passed not through ambition, but inheritance. Authority shifted from earned competence to assumed entitlement. The foundation remained, but the leadership changed. Congdon died in 1916. Leaving behind immense wealth and a carefully constructed estate. On paper, everything was secure. Trusts were established. Assets were allocated. Glensheen stood firm. But the absence of its architect created an invisible vacuum. Without Chester Congdon, the mansion's balance depended on relationships rather than rules. And relationships, unlike contracts, are unpredictable. Elizabeth Congdon, Chester's widow, inherited not only wealth, but responsibility. She lived for decades after his death, maintaining the mansion and its routines. But the world around her transformed rapidly. Industrial America gave way to modern consumer culture. The rigid hierarchies that once defined elite households began to erode. Yet inside Glensheen, time moved differently. The mansion resisted change. Its systems remained intact. Even as their relevance faded, this resistance would prove costly. As generations passed, Glensheen became less adaptive, more inward-looking. Wealth insulated its inhabitants from consequences, but it also isolated them from perspective. Dependency replaced autonomy. Entitlement replaced purpose. The mansion, once a symbol of strategic foresight, slowly became a container for unresolved tension. Chester Congdon had built Glensheen to protect his family from instability. He succeeded financially. But protection, when taken to its extreme, can create vulnerability. By sealing his world too tightly, Congdon ensured that conflicts would have nowhere to escape. Pressure accumulated quietly, unnoticed by those who believed themselves secure. The irony is unavoidable. Kongdon mastered external risk markets, competitors, legal threats, but underestimated internal risk. He assumed loyalty where resentment could grow. He trusted inheritance to preserve values without understanding how time reshapes motive. Glensheen stood as proof of his success, but also as evidence of his blind spot. By the time tragedy struck decades later, the conditions had already been set. The murders were not an intrusion into a stable world. They were the result of a system that had long outlived its creator. The mansion did not cause what happened, but it shaped it. Its walls enforced silence. Its wealth distorted relationships. Its permanence discouraged accountability. To understand Glensheen's dark legacy, one must look beyond the crime itself and into the structure that preceded it. Chester Kongdon did not build a house of violence. He built a house of control. And when control passed into weaker hands, the consequences became unavoidable. Glensheen was born from industrial genius and strategic restraint. It survived its founder, but it could not escape the cost of being designed for permanence in a world defined by change. When construction on Glensheen began in the early years of the 20th century, it was not treated as a domestic project but as an operation. Chester Kongdon approached the building of his mansion the same way he approached railroads, mineral rights and legal empires, with precision, redundancy and control. Every detail was planned to minimize uncertainty and maximize permanence. Glensheen would not simply be large. It would be self-contained, regulated and fortified against both time and intrusion. From its earliest blueprints, the house was designed less as a residence and more as a system. The architectural firm Kongdon selected, Clarence H. Johnston Sr. and Charles Allen Platt, understood this vision immediately. The style chosen, Jacobean revival, was not fashionable excess. It was historical authority. Heavy stone walls, symmetrical facades, and restrained ornamentation communicated stability rather than indulgence. The mansion was meant to look as though it had always existed and would continue to exist long after its occupants were gone. This was not aspirational architecture. It was declarative. Location mattered as much as design. Glensheen was positioned deliberately along the shore of Lake Superior, elevated just enough to command the landscape without appearing exposed. The lake provided natural isolation. Harsh winters discouraged casual visitors. The estate's grounds were expansive but not open. Movement was controlled. Sightlines were intentional. From the beginning, Glensheen separated those inside from those outside. Inside, the mansion revealed its true complexity. Glensheen contained more than 50 rooms, but its most striking feature was not scale, it was organization. Separate corridors for servants ensured that daily operations occurred invisibly. Staircases were placed to preserve hierarchy. Rooms were designed to limit intimacy and reinforce formality. Privacy was protected not through warmth but through distance. Technological innovation played a critical role. Glensheen was outfitted with advanced heating, plumbing, and electrical systems at a time when such features were rare even in major cities. A central vacuum system allowed cleaning without noise or intrusion. Intercoms enabled communication without physical interaction. Doors could be locked and monitored with unusual precision. The house anticipated needs before they arose, minimizing reliance on human judgment. Yet this efficiency came at a psychological cost. The house reduced spontaneity. Every action had a place, a path, a procedure. Life inside Glensheen unfolded along predetermined routes. Servants followed strict protocols. Family members occupied defined zones. Interaction was structured, not organic. The house did not encourage emotional closeness. It enforced order. Material choices reinforced this atmosphere. Imported stone, hand-carved wood, and custom ironwork emphasized durability over comfort. The mansion felt solid, unyielding. Even its beauty was disciplined. Decorative elements avoided excess. Art served function. Nothing invited relaxation. Everything communicated authority. The layout of Glensheen also concealed more than it revealed. Hidden storage areas, back staircases, and concealed doors allowed staff to move unseen. These features were practical, but they also created an environment where observation was one-sided. Power could see without being seen. Control could operate without confrontation. Security was implicit rather than overt. There were no visible guards, but access was limited. The mansion's size alone created distance. At night, sections could be sealed. During winter, isolation became absolute. Glensheen was prepared for siege conditions without acknowledging the possibility of threat. The surrounding estate reinforced this separation. Gardens were manicured but enclosed. Paths guided movement deliberately. Fences were subtle, but effective. The landscape did not invite wandering. It directed behavior. Nature itself was curated to reflect discipline. This architectural philosophy mirrored Chester Congdon's worldview. He believed systems, once perfected, should run indefinitely. Human error could be managed through design. Emotion could be regulated through structure. Conflict could be prevented through hierarchy. Glensheen was an experiment in applying industrial logic to domestic life. For years, it appeared successful. The household ran smoothly. Servants performed efficiently. The family lived insulated from external disruption. The mansion aged gracefully, resisting decay. Visitors admired its craftsmanship without sensing its rigidity. To outsiders, Glensheen represented the ideal of controlled luxury. But control is not the same as resilience. Systems that eliminate flexibility also eliminate adaptation. As decades passed, the mansion remained unchanged while the world evolved rapidly. Social norms shifted. Family dynamics transformed. Economic realities altered expectations. Yet Glensheen stayed fixed, preserving an outdated structure within a modern world. This mismatch created tension. Younger generations inherited not only wealth, but an environment unsuited to their needs. The mansion demanded conformity without offering purpose. Authority existed without accountability. Privilege came with confinement. The house did not adjust. It expected submission. Even Elizabeth Congdon, who lived in Glensheen long after her husband's death, became increasingly isolated within its walls. Age reduced mobility. Dependence increased. The systems designed to protect now restricted. The mansion that once represented security began to feel like a maze. The irony is that Glensheen functioned exactly as intended. It maintained order. It preserved assets. It limited intrusion. But it failed to account for the one variable that cannot be engineered away: human desire. Resentment does not disappear in structured environments. It accumulates. By the time tragedy struck, Glensheen's design had already shaped the conditions. Its hidden passages, locked doors, and isolated rooms did not cause violence, but they influenced how it unfolded. The mansion did not scream danger. It absorbed it. Glensheen stands today as a masterwork of architecture, but also as a case study in over-design. It demonstrates the limits of control when applied to human relationships. Stone can endure centuries. Systems can function flawlessly. But without adaptability, permanence becomes pressure. The mansion was built to protect a dynasty from chaos. Instead, it became the stage on which control collapsed. Glensheen did not fail structurally. It failed socially. And that failure was designed into its walls long before anyone noticed. In building Glensheen, Chester Congdon created an enduring monument to order. What he could not design was a way for that order to survive human change. By the time Glensheen settled into its rhythm, life inside the mansion followed a pattern so rigid it felt rehearsed. Days unfolded according to schedules established decades earlier, and deviation was rare. The household functioned like a private institution rather than a family home. Servants rose before dawn, moved through hidden corridors, and completed their tasks with near invisibility. Meals were prepared and served with precision. Rooms were cleaned, fires tended, and doors secured, all without disrupting the illusion of effortless order. To live at Glensheen was not to inhabit space freely, but to occupy a role within a carefully maintained system. For the Congdon family, This structure defined relationships as much as routines. Emotional expression was subdued. Affection was formal. Authority flowed in one direction. Chester Congdon had believed that discipline created stability, and that belief lingered long after his death. His widow, Elizabeth Congdon, inherited not just the estate but its philosophy. She maintained the household with quiet determination, preserving her husband's vision of order even as the world outside transformed rapidly. Elizabeth lived surrounded by beauty, yet increasingly alone. As years passed, friends died, social circles narrowed, and the mansion grew quieter. Wealth ensured comfort, but it could not replace companionship. The very systems that once shielded her from inconvenience now amplified her isolation. Servants attended to her needs, but relationships remained professional, never intimate. Trust existed, but it was transactional. Inside Glensheen, hierarchy was unmistakable. Staff knew their places. Family members occupied defined roles. Privacy was guarded, but openness was rare. Conversations were restrained, measured, and often avoided altogether. Conflict did not erupt. It settled quietly beneath the surface. Resentments were not voiced. Expectations were assumed. The mansion's layout reinforced this emotional distance. Large rooms separated individuals physically and psychologically. Doors closed softly, but decisively. Long corridors discouraged casual encounters. Even shared spaces felt formal, discouraging spontaneity. There was no room for disorder and little room for vulnerability. As Elizabeth aged, dependence slowly replaced autonomy. Tasks once managed personally were delegated. Mobility declined. Medical assistance became necessary. The introduction of a live-in nurse was a practical decision, but it further altered the household's balance. Authority shifted subtly. Power dynamics changed. Elizabeth remained wealthy and respected, but physically she became reliant on those around her. This dependence heightened the mansion's tension. Glensheen had never been designed for vulnerability. It excelled at control, not care. As Elizabeth's world contracted to a few rooms, the vastness of the estate became oppressive. Silence grew heavier. Isolation deepened. The mansion no longer protected her. It enclosed her. At the same time, the question of inheritance loomed quietly but persistently. Wealth that once symbolized achievement now represented future entitlement. The Congdon fortune, carefully structured to endure, became a focal point of expectation. Relationships strained under its weight. Gratitude blurred into assumption. Responsibility gave way to anticipation. Marjorie Congdon, Elizabeth's adopted daughter, occupied an uneasy position within this environment. Adoption had secured her place legally, but emotional security remained elusive. She lived in the shadow of a legacy she had not created, inside a system she did not control. Her relationship with Elizabeth was complex, marked by dependence, resentment, and unresolved expectation. The mansion did not offer clarity. It magnified ambiguity. Marjorie's marriage to Roger Caldwell introduced another variable. Caldwell entered Glensheen not as a servant nor as a patriarch, but as an outsider attached to inheritance. His presence altered the household's dynamics subtly at first, then irreversibly. Wealth changed hands not immediately but prospectively. Power shifted not officially, but psychologically. Inside Glensheen, perception mattered as much as reality. Who controlled access? Who managed schedules? Who influenced decisions? These questions were never addressed openly, but they shaped daily life. The mansion's silence allowed assumptions to flourish unchecked. Servants observed everything and spoke nothing. Their proximity to both authority and vulnerability placed them in a unique position, yet their voices were absent from decision-making. Loyalty was expected, not earned. Discretion was enforced, not rewarded. The household relied on silence as currency. This environment created a paradox. Glensheen was designed to prevent disorder, yet it suppressed resolution. Problems were contained rather than confronted. Tensions accumulated without release. Wealth removed urgency. allowing dissatisfaction to linger indefinitely. As Elizabeth's health declined further, her reliance on routine intensified. Change became threatening. Familiarity became essential. The mansion's predictability offered comfort, but also rigidity. Decisions regarding care, finances, and control became increasingly sensitive. Trust narrowed. The introduction of legal instruments, trusts, wills, amendments added another layer of complexity. Documents replaced dialogue. Attorneys replaced conversation. Intentions were recorded rather than explained. This legal formalization deepened emotional distance, transforming relationships into clauses and conditions. Within Glensheen, the past exerted constant pressure on the present. Chester Congdon's legacy remained unspoken but omnipresent. His systems endured. His assumptions persisted. Adaptation was discouraged. Innovation was unnecessary. The mansion existed to preserve, not evolve. This resistance to change created an atmosphere where personal grievances could not be processed openly. Frustration had no outlet. Dependency had no acknowledgement. Entitlement grew quietly, unchecked by transparency or accountability. By the mid-1970s, Glensheen was no longer a living household in the conventional sense. It was a preserved environment operating on inherited momentum. The system still functioned, but the relationships within them were strained beyond recognition. The mansion appeared stable, but its emotional foundations were fractured. No alarms sounded. No warnings were issued. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss. Glensheen continued to project calm authority. Visitors saw elegance. Locals saw history. No one saw pressure, but pressure does not announce itself. It accumulates silently, especially in places designed to suppress disruption. Glensheen had perfected containment. What it had not accounted for was what happens when containment replaces connection. The tragedy that would eventually unfold was not born in a single moment of rage. It was cultivated slowly, nourished by isolation, expectation, and silence. The mansion did not create these forces, but it concentrated them. It amplified them. Life inside Glensheen was orderly, controlled, and restrained. It was also emotionally brittle. When the structure finally fractured, it would do so without warning, revealing that beneath decades of discipline lay unresolved human need. The mansion that once symbolized mastery over chaos had become a closed system, unable to release it. By the time inheritance became an unspoken presence inside Glensheen, it had already begun to reshape every relationship within its walls. Wealth that once symbolized achievement now represented anticipation. The Congdon fortune was no longer about what had been built, but about who would control what remained. This transition from earned power to expected reward altered the emotional gravity of the household. Conversations became guarded. Motives became suspect. Silence, once a sign of discipline, became a shield. Elizabeth Congdon had outlived the world that created her fortune. She remained wealthy, respected, and authoritative, but increasingly aware that her influence was finite. Age reduced her physical strength but sharpened her awareness of dependency. Decisions about care, companionship, and control now carried long-term consequences. Trust, once assumed, became something she evaluated carefully and often quietly. Marjorie Congdon's position within this environment was uniquely fragile. Adopted as an infant, she was legally secure but emotionally unanchored. Her identity within the family was defined by law rather than lineage, and this distinction lingered beneath every interaction. She had grown up surrounded by privilege, yet always aware that her place depended on validation rather than blood. Glensheen did not offer reassurance. It amplified uncertainty. As Elizabeth aged, Marjorie's proximity to power increased. She became more involved in daily affairs, schedules, and decisions. This involvement blurred the line between support and control. To Elizabeth, assistance was necessary. To Marjorie, it may have felt like recognition long delayed. But proximity to wealth often breeds expectation, and expectation is rarely patient. The introduction of Roger Caldwell intensified these dynamics. Caldwell entered Glensheen as a husband, but also as an observer of immense wealth governed by silence. He had not grown up inside systems of inherited authority. To him, the Congdon fortune may have appeared not as legacy, but as opportunity. His presence disrupted established hierarchies without openly challenging them. Influence shifted quietly. Marriage altered perception. Marjorie was no longer an individual beneficiary. She was part of a unit. Caldwell's ambitions, frustrations, and expectations became inseparable from her own. Decisions made within Glensheen now carried implications beyond family dynamics. They affected futures, lifestyles, and identities. Elizabeth's increasing reliance on care complicated trust further. The mansion's systems had been designed for order, not vulnerability. Dependence created leverage, whether acknowledged or not. Those who controlled access to schedules, to medication, to information held subtle power. In a house where authority had always flowed downward, this inversion was destabilizing. Legal instruments became tools of reassurance and anxiety simultaneously. Trusts were adjusted. Wills were reviewed. Provisions were clarified. But legal clarity did not produce emotional clarity. Documents replaced dialogue. Attorneys replaced honesty. Each revision signaled uncertainty rather than confidence. The Congdon fortune was vast, but it was not infinite. Maintenance costs were substantial. Taxes loomed. The estate's preservation required careful management. Wealth, once static, now demanded attention. For those anticipating inheritance, delay became frustration. For Elizabeth, caution became necessity. Within Glensheen, expectation became ambient. It was never stated, but always present. Who would inherit the mansion? Who would control the assets? Who would decide what was preserved and what was sold? These questions hovered over every interaction, shaping behavior subtly but persistently. Resentment thrives in environments where power is opaque. When decisions are made without explanation, interpretations fill the void. Silence invites assumption. Inside Glensheen, assumption became currency. Small gestures were scrutinized. Delays were interpreted. Neutral actions were assigned motive. Servants, ever present yet unseen, observed these shifts without comment. Their neutrality masked insight. They witnessed conversations cut short, expressions suppressed, frustrations redirected. Their silence reinforced the household's isolation, ensuring that tension circulated inward rather than dissipating. The mansion's design exacerbated this inward turn. Separate rooms allowed individuals to retreat rather than resolve. Long corridors delayed confrontation. Formal spaces discouraged intimacy. Glensheen was optimized for separation at precisely the moment unity was needed most. Elizabeth's vulnerability intensified the stakes. Her health dictated timelines, but uncertainty ruled outcomes. The inevitability of death transformed patience into anxiety. For those awaiting inheritance, time became adversary rather than ally. For Elizabeth, time became pressure. Trust narrowed. Decision-making centralized. Elizabeth relied increasingly on those closest to her physically, not necessarily emotionally. Dependence distorted judgment. Familiarity replaced evaluation. In such conditions, power shifts unnoticed until it has already occurred. Marjorie's role expanded, but clarity did not. She occupied a space between daughter and caretaker, beneficiary and subordinate. Her authority was informal, her responsibility undefined. This ambiguity created strain. Boundaries blurred. Expectations conflicted. Caldwell's presence introduced external perspective, but also external ambition. He was not bound by Congdon tradition. His relationship to the fortune was transactional rather than historical. This difference mattered. It altered priorities. It reframed patience as inefficiency. Inside Glensheen, the past exerted gravitational pull. Chester Congdon's systems remained intact, but his assumptions no longer applied. He had believed order could prevent conflict. He had underestimated how inheritance transforms relationships. Wealth that once unified purpose now fragmented it. The household's refusal to address these tensions openly ensured they would intensify privately. Conflict avoided does not disappear. It accumulates. Within Glensheen, accumulation was silent but relentless. By the mid-1970s, the mansion was no longer simply a residence. It was a pressure chamber. Every interaction carried weight beyond itself. Every decision hinted at future consequences. Every silence reinforced mistrust. The Kongdon fortune had created a paradox. It provided security while generating vulnerability. It ensured comfort while distorting motive. It preserved legacy while undermining connection. Inheritance, once intended as continuity, became the source of fracture. It transformed care into calculation, proximity into leverage, and loyalty into expectation. Glensheen had been built to endure generations. Instead, it magnified the fault lines between them. The tragedy that followed did not emerge from greed alone. It emerged from prolonged ambiguity, unspoken resentment, and the corrosive effect of wealth unaccompanied by transparency. The mansion did not cause these forces. It concentrated them. By the time the night of violence arrived, the conditions had been cultivated carefully and quietly. The fractures were already there. The inheritance had already done its damage. What remained was inevitability, masquerading as surprise. By the summer of 1977, Glensheen had become a house defined less by history than by tension. On the surface, nothing appeared unusual. The mansion still rose with the same composed authority along Lake Superior. Its gardens were trimmed. Its rooms remained immaculate. Yet inside, the atmosphere had shifted almost imperceptibly from order to unease. What had once been a carefully managed household now operated on routine rather than trust. And routine has a way of masking danger until it is too late. Elizabeth Kongdon was 83 years old, physically frail but mentally alert. Age had not softened her authority. It had sharpened it. She remained acutely aware of her wealth, her vulnerability, and the fact that every decision she made now echoed beyond her lifetime. Dependence weighed on her. She required constant assistance, particularly at night. This necessity placed extraordinary power in the hands of those closest to her, especially Marjorie and Roger Caldwell, who lived under the same roof. Nighttime at Glensheen was its own world. The mansion's vastness, once designed for privacy and efficiency, became oppressive after dark. Long corridors amplified every sound. Doors separated by stone and hardwood created pockets of isolation. The house did not sleep as a single unit. It fractured into zones of silence. For Elizabeth, night represented vulnerability. For those around her, it represented opportunity, obligation, or burden, depending on perspective. The evening of June 26, 1977, began without spectacle. Dinner was uneventful. Conversations followed familiar patterns. There were no public arguments, no visible warning signs. That normalcy is what makes the events that followed so unsettling. Violence did not arrive suddenly from chaos. It emerged from routine. Sometime after midnight, the mansion settled into quiet. Staff retired to their quarters. The lake outside lay dark and motionless. Inside, Elizabeth prepared for bed, assisted as usual. Nothing suggested this night would be different from dozens before it. And yet, this would be the last night Glensheen functioned as a household rather than a crime scene. The attack on Elizabeth Kongdon was swift and intimate. It occurred in her bedroom, the most private space in the mansion. There was no forced entry, no struggle that echoed through the halls. Whoever entered that room was someone Elizabeth did not fear in that moment. Trust, or at least familiarity, opened the door. That detail would later become one of the most damning. Elizabeth was suffocated in her bed. The act required proximity, deliberation, and control. This was not impulsive violence. It was quiet, intentional, and irreversible. The woman who had presided over Glensheen for decades, who had managed wealth, servants, and legacy with iron discipline, was killed in silence in the room meant to protect her. The house did not react. No alarms sounded. No neighbors noticed. Glensheen absorbed the act without protest, as it had absorbed decades of tension before it. For hours, nothing appeared wrong. Later that same night, another murder occurred. Nurse Vilma Petila, who had arrived for her overnight shift, was attacked near the stairwell. Unlike Elizabeth, Velma fought back. The struggle was violent, chaotic, and desperate. She was beaten and pushed down the stairs, sustaining fatal injuries. Her death transformed the crime from a private act into something broader and uncontrollable. This second killing changed everything. Elizabeth's death could, in theory, have been concealed or explained away temporarily. Velma's could not. The presence of a murdered employee introduced witnesses, timelines, and accountability. It shattered any illusion of control. By morning, the mansion was no longer silent. Staff members discovered the bodies. Confusion turned to panic. Authorities were called. The world Glensheen had been insulated from for nearly 70 years arrived abruptly through police radios. Flashing lights and investigative teams. Law enforcement entered a house designed to resist intrusion. The architecture complicated investigation. Multiple staircases, locked rooms, and hidden corridors made reconstruction difficult. The very features that once symbolized security now obstructed clarity. From the beginning, suspicion narrowed quickly. There was no sign of forced entry. No evidence of robbery. Valuable items remained untouched. The violence was personal, not opportunistic. Investigators understood immediately that the perpetrator had been someone inside the household, someone familiar with routines and access. Attention turned inward. Family members were questioned. Staff were interviewed. Timelines were reconstructed minute by minute. Within hours, the focus settled on Roger Caldwell. His behavior raised questions. His explanations contained inconsistencies. His emotional responses did not align with shock or grief. The house that had once shielded its occupants now exposed them. Physical evidence reinforced suspicion. Caldwell bore scratches consistent with the struggle. His clothing showed signs that contradicted his account of the night. The presence of Velma Petila transformed the case from speculation into prosecution. Her resistance left traces that could not be ignored. As investigators pieced together events, the narrative that emerged was chilling in its simplicity. This was not an outsider breaching a fortress. It was a collapse from within. The danger Elizabeth Congdon feared had not come from the world beyond Glensheen's gates. It had come from the relationships she relied upon most. The psychological weight of the crime extended beyond violence. It represented the failure of every system Glensheen had embodied. Wealth did not protect. Architecture did not deter. Control did not prevent betrayal. The mansion had been designed to eliminate unpredictability. Instead, it had concentrated it. News spread quickly. The shock was national. America had seen wealthy families fall before, but rarely with such stark contrast between setting and act. Headlines emphasized the mansion's grandeur, the lakefront serenity, the age of the victim. The public struggled to reconcile the image of Glensheen with the brutality that occurred inside it. For Marjorie Congdon, the aftermath was catastrophic. Her position shifted instantly from heir to suspect by association. The fortune she stood to inherit now came stained with blood. The legitimacy she had sought her entire life was replaced by scrutiny and suspicion. The mansion that had promised security now represented danger. Roger Caldwell's arrest marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. But the deeper rupture had already occurred. Glensheen was no longer a symbol of permanence. It had become a warning. The murders revealed what had been building silently for years. The isolation, the dependency, the unspoken resentments, the power imbalances created by inheritance. None of these forces were visible to casual observers, but together they formed a structure as real as stone. In the days that followed, investigators continued to comb through the mansion. Each room told a different story. Each corridor seemed to echo with absence. The house felt unchanged, yet irrevocably altered. Glensheen had survived economic collapse, industrial decline, and generational transition. What it could not survive intact was the internal erosion of trust. The violence of that night did not destroy the mansion physically. It destroyed its meaning. From that moment forward, Glensheen would never again be viewed simply as a home. It became a site of reckoning where the illusion of inherited security was exposed as fragile, and where the darkest consequences of wealth left unmanaged were finally made visible. The night of June 26 did not erupt suddenly. It concluded a long process. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the sound of a legacy collapsing inward. The arrest of Roger Caldwell did not bring clarity to Glensheen. It deepened the unease. In the days following the murders, the mansion existed in a strange limbo. No longer a private residence, but not yet a public symbol. Investigators moved through its corridors with methodical precision, while the outside world began constructing its own version of events. Facts, rumors, and assumptions collided, and in that collision, the case transformed from a local tragedy into a national obsession. From the beginning, Caldwell's story struggled to hold together. His account of the night shifted subtly with each retelling, never dramatically enough to appear overtly deceptive, but consistently enough to raise concern. He described hearing noises, moving through the house, encountering Velma Patila unexpectedly. Yet timelines conflicted. Distances within the mansion did not align with his movements. Small details, door positions, light switches, stair usage created fractures in his narrative. In a house where routine had once been everything, inconsistency stood out sharply. Physical evidence became the backbone of the prosecution. Scratches on Caldwell's face and hands were consistent with the struggle, difficult to explain away as coincidence. Fibers, traces of blood, and the positioning of Velma Patila's body suggested a violent encounter that did not match Caldwell's claims of accidental confrontation. The stairwell, once a simple architectural feature, became a central character in the case. Its dimensions and angles analyzed repeatedly to determine whether the fatal fall could have occurred as described. Yet despite the mounting evidence, the case was never simple. Caldwell was not an outsider. He was not a stranger who had wandered into Glensheen seeking opportunity. He was family by marriage, integrated into the household's rhythms, trusted with access and responsibility. This fact complicated everything. The jury would not be asked merely to assess evidence. They would be asked to imagine betrayal occurring in one of the most controlled environments in America. Marjorie Congdon's presence loomed over every aspect of the investigation, even when she was not formally accused. As Elizabeth's adopted daughter and primary heir, her role invited scrutiny that went beyond legality. Public perception often blurred lines between association and guilt. Though charges were never brought against her, her proximity to both the victim and the accused ensured she remained central to public speculation. The question of motive dominated early coverage. Why would Roger Caldwell commit such an act? Prosecutors argued that money was the driving force. Elizabeth Congdon's fortune was immense, but its distribution was tightly controlled. Caldwell's financial situation was unstable. Debt, resentment, and dependence created a volatile mix. In this narrative, the murder was not spontaneous. It was a calculated attempt to accelerate inheritance and eliminate obstacles. Defense attorneys countered with an entirely different picture. They portrayed Caldwell as overwhelmed, caught in an impossible domestic situation, blamed for events he did not orchestrate. They suggested alternative scenarios, questioned the reliability of timelines, and emphasized the lack of direct witnesses. In a case built largely on circumstantial evidence, doubt became their most powerful tool. The trial unfolded under intense media scrutiny. Cameras followed every development. Reporters dissected testimony line by line. The contrast between Glensheen's elegance and the brutality of the crimes continued to captivate the public imagination. Each detail fed a growing narrative about the dangers hidden beneath wealth and privilege. Inside the courtroom, Glensheen was reconstructed verbally. Witnesses described rooms, corridors, routines. Jurors were asked to visualize a space they had never seen, to understand how silence could exist alongside violence, how proximity did not guarantee safety. The mansion became an abstract concept, recreated through floor plans, photographs, and testimony. Stripped of its grandeur and reduced to a series of decisions and movements, Velma, Petila's role gained increasing significance as the trial progressed. She was not merely a victim. She was a witness who never had the chance to testify. Her struggle provided crucial evidence. Her injuries spoke where words could not. The prosecution emphasized that her death transformed the crime from an internal family matter into a public act of violence. Without Velma, the case might have dissolved into ambiguity. With her, it demanded resolution. As testimony accumulated, the jury faced a difficult task. They were not presented with a dramatic confession or incontrovertible forensic proof. Instead, they were asked to weigh patterns, inconsistencies, and probabilities. The case hinged on whether the totality of evidence formed a coherent truth or merely a plausible story. Outside the courtroom, public opinion shifted constantly. Some viewed Caldwell as an obvious perpetrator, undone by greed and desperation. Others questioned whether he had become a convenient scapegoat, sacrificed to preserve the image of the Condon legacy. The absence of definitive answers created space for speculation, conspiracy, and doubt. When the verdict finally arrived, it was decisive. Roger Caldwell was found guilty of the murders. The sentence confirmed what many had already accepted, yet it did not bring closure. Instead, it solidified Glensheen's transformation from a symbol of wealth into a symbol of unresolved complexity. For Marjorie Condon, the outcome was paradoxical. Legally cleared, she nonetheless emerged from the trial isolated and stigmatized. The inheritance she received was inseparable from public suspicion. Her identity became permanently entangled with the crime, regardless of judicial outcomes. The mansion she inherited was no longer merely a home. It was a monument to tragedy. The legal process concluded, but the psychological impact lingered. For those who followed the case, questions remained. Was justice fully served? Did the verdict explain everything or only enough? The house itself offered no answers. It stood unchanged, indifferent to legal conclusions, its walls holding secrets that testimony could only approximate. In the years that followed, Glensheen entered a new phase of existence. It was no longer occupied as a private residence in the traditional sense. Eventually, it would become a historic site, open to the public, its story curated and controlled. Yet, even as guides led visitors through its rooms, the memory of violence lingered. Beneath the surface, the trial had exposed the fragility of the systems Glensheen represented. Wealth had not prevented conflict. Privacy had not ensured safety. Legal resolution had not erased ambiguity. The mansion remained intact, but its authority was diminished. What emerged from the courtroom was not a neat conclusion, but a cautionary narrative. Glensheen's tragedy revealed how power, when combined with isolation, can distort relationships beyond recognition. It showed how environments designed to control chaos can instead conceal it until it erupts. The conviction closed one chapter, but it did not end the story. Glensheen's legacy was no longer defined solely by architecture or fortune. It was defined by the moment when control failed, and the consequences became impossible to contain. As the public turned its attention elsewhere, Glensheen remained silent and unmoved, overlooking Lake Superior. Its walls no longer symbolized permanence without cost. They symbolized the price of believing that wealth can insulate against human nature. Section 7 is not about resolution. It is about exposure. The trial did not restore order. It revealed how little order had ever existed. And in that revelation, Glensheen ceased to be just a mansion. It became a reminder that no legacy, no matter how carefully constructed, is immune to collapse from within. After the verdict, Glensheen entered a quieter but more unsettling chapter 1, defined not by headlines or courtrooms but by absence. The violence was over, the legal process complete, yet the mansion felt heavier than ever. Rooms once organized around daily routine now existed without purpose. Silence settled differently, no longer the controlled stillness of wealth, but the echo of something unresolved. Glensheen had survived scrutiny, but it had not escaped transformation. Marjorie Condon remained at the center of this altered world. Though never charged, she was forever bound to the murders in the public imagination. Her inheritance arrived not as triumph but as burden. The fortune she received carried expectations, suspicion, and an unspoken question that followed her everywhere. How much did she know, and when did she know it? The law had answered one version of that question, but public memory refused to accept a clean ending. For Marjorie, Glensheen became less a home and more a reminder of loss. Elizabeth Congdon's presence lingered in every room. The rituals of authority that had defined the mansion's life now felt hollow. The power structure that once revolved around Elizabeth had collapsed, leaving no clear replacement. What remained was ownership without control, wealth without legitimacy, and legacy without certainty. Beyond the Congdon family, Glensheen's story continued to ripple outward. The murders reshaped how Americans talked about inherited wealth. The mansion became shorthand for a broader unease, the idea that extreme privilege, rather than shielding families from harm, could isolate them from accountability and connection. Glensheen was no longer admired solely for its beauty. It was studied for what it revealed. As time passed, interest in the case did not fade. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. The story was retold repeatedly, each version emphasizing different aspects: greed, betrayal, psychological pressure, or architectural irony. Glensheen became a narrative framework through which audiences explored the darker side of old money. Each retelling reinforced the mansion's dual identity, museum and crime scene. Eventually, Glensheen was open to the public. This decision marked a profound shift. A house built to exclude was now inviting strangers inside. Visitors walked through the same corridors where investigators once stood, listened to guides recounting facts layered with restraint. The mansion was preserved meticulously, as though perfection could contain memory. Yet no amount of curation could neutralize the weight of what had occurred. Public access transformed Glensheen into a controlled experience of tragedy. The narrative was organized, measured, and educational. But beneath that structure, something more unsettling persisted. Visitors often described a feeling of unease that went beyond curiosity. The house felt watchful, not haunted in the supernatural sense, but burdened by awareness. Glensheen did not forget. This transition raised difficult questions. Could a place marked by violence ever be neutral again? Was preservation an act of respect, or a way of distancing from discomfort? Glensheen's status as a historic site forced society to confront how it consumes tragedy, how it turns private suffering into public history. For Duluth, the mansion became both an asset and an anomaly. It attracted tourism, scholarship, and attention. Yet it also carried a stigma. Locals spoke of it with a mixture of pride and caution. The murders were never far from conversation. Glensheen was inseparable from its darkest night. No matter how many decades passed, the legacy of the Congdon wealth itself grew increasingly abstract. The industrial empire that had built Glensheen faded into history, replaced by financial systems Elizabeth Congdon would scarcely recognize. What remained was the structure, the stone, the wood, the rooms, and the story attached to them. The fortune that once justified the mansion's existence became secondary to the cautionary tale it embodied. Psychologists and sociologists revisited the case as an example of how isolation and dependency can distort relationships. Glensheen represented an environment where hierarchy replaced intimacy, where care was transactional, and where emotional needs were managed rather than addressed. In this context, the murders were not anomalies, but extreme outcomes of long-term dysfunction. The architecture itself came under renewed interpretation. Scholars noted how Glensheen's design emphasized separation. Servants' quarters removed from family spaces, private staircases hidden from view, rooms arranged to minimize overlap. These choices reflected a worldview obsessed with control and distance. After the murders, those same features appeared ominous. What had once signified order now suggested concealment. As years passed, Glensheen became a site of projection. For some, it symbolized the dangers of greed. For others, the vulnerability of aging elites. For many, it represented the failure of systems meant to ensure safety and continuity. The mansion absorbed these meanings without resistance, its physical permanence allowing narratives to layer endlessly. The Congdon murders also altered how America remembers its wealthy dynasties. Unlike the Vanderbilts or Astors, whose declines unfolded over generations, Glensheen's rupture was immediate and violent. It compressed the arc of rise and fall into a single night. This compression made the story unforgettable. For visitors walking through the bedroom where Elizabeth Congdon died, the experience was often sobering. The room is modest by mansion standards, carefully preserved, almost understated. There is no spectacle. That restraint amplifies the horror. The absence of drama forces confrontation with reality. This was not a cinematic event, but a human one. Vilma Petila's presence is felt differently. Her story resonates as one of unintended sacrifice. She was not part of the legacy she died protecting. Her death reframed the crime as more than an internal family collapse. It became a tragedy that crossed class lines, exposing how those closest to power often bear its consequences without sharing its benefits. Over time, Glensheen's narrative settled into something resembling a modern cautionary myth. It warned against believing that wealth can resolve emotional fracture, that architecture can substitute for trust, or that legacy can outlast accountability. The mansion stood as proof that control, when pursued without empathy, becomes brittle, yet Glensheen endures. It stands against Lake Superior as it always has, unchanged in form, if not in meaning. Visitors still admire its craftsmanship, its gardens, its view, but admiration now comes layered with reflection. Beauty no longer obscures cost. Section 8 is not about aftermath alone. It is about transformation. The murders did not simply end lives. They altered how a place, a family, and a fortune are understood. Glensheen became a living archive of contradiction, elegant yet unsettling. Preserved yet exposed, silent yet endlessly discussed. In this phase of its existence, Glensheen no longer belongs to the Congdons alone. It belongs to collective memory. Every retelling, every visit, every question asked keeps the story alive. And in that persistence lies its final power, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a reminder that no structure, no matter how grand, can outlast the truths buried inside it. As the years passed, Glensheen's story settled into the deeper layers of American memory. No longer breaking news, but something more enduring and unsettling. The mansion became a reference point whenever discussions turned to inherited wealth, isolation, and the psychological cost of privilege. It was no longer viewed simply as the site of a crime, but as a case study, one that seemed to explain something uncomfortable about how power operates when it is left unquestioned. For too long, the public fascination with Glensheen did not fade with time. It matured. Early coverage focused on shock and scandal. Later interpretations searched for meaning. Historians, writers, and filmmakers revisited the case not to sensationalize the violence, but to understand the environment that made it possible. In doing so, they shifted attention from individual guilt to structural failure. Glensheen was no longer examined only for who committed the murders, but for what kind of world allowed them to happen. This shift reframed Elizabeth Congdon's life and authority. She was no longer portrayed merely as a victim or matriarch, but as a symbol of an era when wealth equaled control. Her management of Glensheen reflected a worldview built on order, discipline, and hierarchy. These values had once ensured stability, but over time they hardened into rigidity. Dependency replaced mutual trust. Loyalty became transactional. Care turned into obligation. In that light, the murders were no longer seen as an abrupt rupture, but as the culmination of prolonged emotional strain. The environment inside Glensheen encouraged silence over confrontation and obedience over honesty. Problems did not surface. They accumulated. When release finally came, it was catastrophic. The American public, particularly during the late 20th century, recognized something familiar in this pattern. Glensheen's story unfolded at a time when old dynasties were losing influence, and inherited wealth was increasingly scrutinized. The mansion's fall from untouchable symbol to cautionary tale mirrored a broader cultural shift. Wealth was no longer assumed to be virtuous. Privacy was no longer seen as harmless. Power demanded explanation. True crime as a genre also evolved alongside Glensheen's legacy. Earlier crime narratives often focused on external threats, strangers, intruders, unknown dangers. Glensheen redirected attention inward. The threat came from proximity, from trust, from familiarity. This inversion reshaped how audiences understood violence, making the story more disturbing precisely because it felt plausible. Glensheen's continued presence as a public site reinforced this psychological impact. Walking through the mansion is not an act of passive observation. Visitors are forced into intimacy with the space. They imagine movement, routine, expectation. The absence of chaos in the architecture intensifies the awareness of what occurred there. The house becomes an active participant in the story, not merely a backdrop. Over time, guides, historians, and curators faced an ethical challenge: how to tell the story without exploiting it. Too much restraint risked erasure. Too much detail risked spectacle. The balance reflected a broader tension in how society consumes tragedy. Glensheen became a testing ground for this balance, shaping conversations about responsible storytelling. The Congdon murders also prompted renewed attention to the role of caregivers within wealthy households. Velma Petila's death underscored the vulnerability of those who exist at the intersection of service and intimacy. Her presence in the mansion was professional, yet her fate was profoundly personal. Her story challenged the notion that wealth insulates everyone within its orbit. In reality, it often amplifies inequality. As scholars revisited the case, they noted how Glensheen exemplified the dangers of concentrated power in domestic settings. Unlike corporations or governments, households operate largely without oversight. Decisions are private, relationships unregulated. When immense wealth is combined with dependency and isolation, accountability can disappear entirely. Glensheen exposed this vulnerability in stark terms. The mansion's architecture continued to invite symbolic interpretation. Its grandeur suggested permanence, yet its story revealed fragility. Its separation of spaces mirrored emotional distance. Its location removed from urban life yet not fully isolated reflected a liminal existence, neither engaged with society nor entirely apart from it. These contradictions deepened its resonance. Culturally, Glensheen joined a small group of places that function as moral landmarks. Like certain battlefields or disaster sites, it carries meaning beyond its physical form. It prompts reflection on choices, systems, and consequences. Its story is invoked not for entertainment alone, but for what it reveals about human behavior under pressure. For newer generations encountering the story for the first time, Glensheen feels oddly contemporary. Themes of caregiving strain, inheritance conflict, mental health, and unequal power remain relevant. The setting may belong to another century, but the dynamics do not. This timelessness ensures the story's persistence. The Congdon murders also challenged the romanticization of old money. Where once dynastic wealth was associated with refinement and stability, Glensheen suggested a darker reality. Wealth, when divorced from accountability and emotional intelligence, can distort relationships beyond repair. The mansion's elegance no longer conceals that truth. It highlights it. In public discourse, Glensheen often appears as shorthand for betrayal within privilege. Its name alone evokes unease. It serves as a reminder that violence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it emerges quietly from environments that appear most controlled. As the decades progressed, Glensheen's role evolved again. It became less about the crime itself and more about remembrance. Visitors did not come seeking answers. They came seeking understanding. The mansion offered none directly. It offered only space, physical and psychological, to confront uncomfortable questions. Those questions linger. Could the tragedy have been prevented? Were there moments when intervention was possible? Or was the system itself too rigid to allow change? Glensheen does not answer. It simply endures, holding these questions within its walls. Section 9 is about reckoning rather than resolution. It examines how a single event reshaped collective understanding of wealth, safety, and trust. Glensheen's power lies not in what it reveals definitively, but in what it forces us to confront repeatedly. The mansion stands today as both artifact and warning. Its story continues not because it is sensational, but because it is instructive. It reminds us that structures built to control life can become prisons of silence, and that the most dangerous fractures are often invisible until they break. In remembering Glensheen, America is not merely recalling a crime. It is examining a mirror, one that reflects the costs of believing that money, legacy, and architecture can substitute for human connection. And in that reflection, the mansion remains as relevant as ever, watching quietly over Lake Superior, its lessons unresolved, its presence undeniable. Glensheen's final legacy does not rest in verdicts or timelines, but in what remains after the story has been told and retold. Long after the headlines faded, long after the courtroom emptied, the mansion continued to exist in a state of uneasy permanence. It stands today not as a resolved chapter of history, but as an open question, one carved in stone, wood, and silence. In that sense, Glensheen never truly moved on from the night of the murders. It absorbed them and carried them forward. Time has altered how the tragedy is remembered, but not its weight. Distance has softened the shock without diminishing the discomfort. The murders are no longer recent enough to feel urgent, yet not distant enough to feel abstract. They exist in a liminal space, where memory and meaning overlap. This is where Glensheen now lives, not just as a place, but as a concept. What ultimately distinguishes Glensheen from other infamous sites is not the violence itself, but the illusion it destroyed. For decades, the mansion represented a belief deeply embedded in American culture, that wealth creates safety, that order ensures control, and that legacy guarantees stability. Glensheen disproved all three in a single night. The collapse was not gradual. It was total. Elizabeth Congdon built her world on discipline and structure. Her authority was meticulous, her household governed by routines designed to eliminate unpredictability. Yet those very systems fostered emotional distance. Care became management. Dependence replaced intimacy. In the end, the structure she trusted most became the environment in which betrayal was possible. The lesson is not that wealth causes violence, but that wealth can mask vulnerability. Glensheen teaches that danger does not always announce itself through disorder. Sometimes it grows quietly within systems that appear flawless. This is why the story continues to resonate. It challenges assumptions rather than confirming them. As a public site, Glensheen now performs an unusual function. It invites people to walk through a cautionary tale. Visitors admire craftsmanship while confronting discomfort. They stand in rooms designed for permanence and reflect on impermanence. The experience is neither purely educational nor purely emotional. It exists somewhere. In between, the mansion's preservation ensures that the story will outlast those who experienced it firsthand. Future generations will encounter Glensheen not through memory, but through interpretation. How they understand it will depend on how honestly the story is told. Glensheen demands restraint, but not silence. It asks for reflection rather than spectacle. In this way, Glensheen has become larger than the Congdon family. It belongs to cultural memory. It informs how society discusses caregiving, inheritance, and power. It shapes how we understand the risks of isolation and the consequences of unexamined authority. The mansion's influence now lies not in what it owns, but in what it reveals. The deaths of Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Petila remain at the heart of this story. One represented immense privilege, the other quiet service. Their lives intersected tragically, exposing a hierarchy that failed both. Remembering Glensheen responsibly means remembering them as individuals, not symbols. It means acknowledging loss without reducing it to narrative convenience. Glensheen also challenges how we measure legacy. The mansion was built to endure for centuries. In that sense, it succeeded. But endurance alone does not define success. What lasts physically may fail morally. Glensheen stands as proof that permanence without humanity is incomplete. As night falls over Lake Superior, the mansion's silhouette remains unchanged. Lights glow in windows that once watched over private lives. The lake reflects the structure with quiet indifference. Nature does not judge Glensheen. It simply continues. That contrast between human meaning and natural continuity underscores the mansion's quiet tragedy. Section 10 is not about closure because closure would suggest resolution. Glensheen offers none. Instead, it offers perspective. It reminds us that control is fragile, that systems built without empathy fracture under pressure, and that silence can be as dangerous as chaos. The story ends where it began, not with noise, but with stillness. A mansion standing alone, preserved and exposed at the same time. Glensheen does not ask to be forgiven or forgotten. It asks to be understood. In understanding Glensheen, we confront an uncomfortable truth. The greatest dangers often emerge not from disorder, but from environments that appear most secure. Wealth can isolate. Power can distort. Legacy can blind. Glensheen endures because it forces us to sit with these truths. It does not explain itself away. It does not soften its lesson. It simply stands holding history in place, waiting for each generation to decide what it means. And perhaps that is Glensheen's final role, not as a mansion of old money, not as a crime scene frozen in time, but as a mirror. One that reflects what happens when control replaces connection, when silence replaces honesty, and when the illusion of safety becomes the most dangerous thing of all.